Hello everyone, I'm Lindsay from Happy Hour Stitches, and thank you so much for joining me today as we sew block 9 of the Happy Hour Stitches block of the month together. Now in this video, I'll be showing my best tips for making this block, as well as some products I use to make it easier. So now before we dive in, let me explain the block of the month a little bit for those who are just joining us. So this block of the month is free to my email subscribers, but only for a limited amount of time. So if you're not signed up yet, click the link in the video description to get signed up today. And each month in 2025, you'll receive a free block sent out to your email. We're obviously in block 9 now, so we've sent quite a few blocks out already. And then later this year, we'll be sending the finishing instructions and the setting instructions out. So this block of the month is just a great way to connect with other quilters, make a beautiful project, and find just joyful time in your sewing room each month. Here's block 9, September's block. So make sure you check your email to get this block pattern and get all of the resources for this block of the month, including fabric requirements and more, at the blog that you can find at the link in the video description. It's been such a fun year of sewing, and we have lots more fun to come. So let's start sewing block 9 together. I have all the pieces for block 9 cut out and organized. This block is a classic block. It's an 8-point star block, which is usually assembled with set and seams, but today we're going to assemble it with basic piecing methods and only squares and rectangles, and I think you're going to love how it comes together. As always, I've sprayed my fabrics with Flatter Spray, which is a starch-free smoothing spray, just to help get all the wrinkles out. They do have unscented spray, but if you're looking for a scent, Fig is actually my favorite scent. So just throwing that out there if you're looking for a recommendation. The first thing we're gonna do is make our half square triangles. So we're gonna grab our larger squares. To make half square triangles, we mark a diagonal line on the wrong side of our lighter squares, and then we sew a 1/4 inch on side of both drawn lines. Now usually I mark with a hair marker, but today I'm going to show one of my other favorite methods I use for making half square triangles, and that is, instead of marking the diagonal line, I'm actually just going to cut on the diagonal. I'm going to link in the video description a video of all the different ways I know how to mark diagonal lines on for your patterns, but this is one of the methods. And when you're doing this method, you do have to cut all of your pieces in half on that diagonal. And what this does is we're just skipping the marking step completely. So normally we would sew a 1/4 inch on both sides of the drawn line and then cut our pieces apart. Well, we're skipping the marking and we went right to cutting. And then all we do is we just layer our pieces and we sew with a 1/4 inch, and then we have our half square triangles. And this is one of my favorite methods because when I sew like this, I can actually use the marks on my machine, just my normal 1/4 inch, to sew along that line instead of kind of having to guess a 1/4 inch outside of the drawn line. I think it's just easier this way. So you mark however works for you, but I'm gonna do this method today. So I'm just gonna take my 2 triangles, or if you're sewing with the other method, you can follow the pattern. It shows you how to do it there. 2 triangles, I'm gonna sew with a 1/4 inch seam, which is the black line on my diagonal seam tape, which I love. And then we're just gonna sew everything together. Let's do a little chain piecing here. Let's sew everything in one run of the machine. I always love chain piecing because all your pieces look like cute little banners or decorations. Okay, we're gonna cut them apart. I'm using my thread cutter I have, which uses an old rotary cutter blade in here to cut my threads. So we're just gonna cut those apart, and now we're gonna press them. When we're pressing our half square triangles, we're gonna be pressing toward the blue. So I always like to set my seam by putting a little heat on top of the seam first, And this just helps those threads sink into the fabric so that I can get a nice smooth diagonal line here on these units with no bulk. So in the last few videos when we've done half square triangles, I have shown you to trim beforehand when the units are still like this, using my Clearly Perfect slotted rulers. But today we're gonna do it by trimming when they're pressed open, just to show a different method. We're gonna trim our half square triangles to 3.5 inches. So normally I use these Clearly Perfect slotted trimmers. They're one of my favorite tools, but I did want to share another method for trimming your half square triangles just because it's good to know. So I'm gonna layer this on. This is my rotating cutting mat, which is a tool I love. I'm gonna put my ruler on here with the 45-degree line on my ruler, align with that diagonal seam. And I wanna make sure that I have excess fabric on the side and top, and that I also have excess fabric outside the 3.5-inch lines. I'll adjust a little bit because we wanna trim it to be square. Once I'm set, trim on this side, trim on this side, rotate my unit, line everything up again, trim and trim. Here's the unit. Next, we're going to be making our stitch and flip units. So we're going to take one of our rectangles, and then we're going to be sewing one of our white squares to this corner here, and one of our blue squares to this corner like this. So I am actually going to mark the diagonal lines with my hair marker on the backs of all of these squares so that we can sew accurately. Hair marker is one of my all-time favorite tools. I use it almost daily in my sewing room for marking and for quilting. And it's cheap. It's less than, I think it's around $5, and you never have to buy another one. So highly recommend having this as a tool in your sewing room. Okay, once these are all marked, let's go over to our sewing machines. So when I'm sewing my stitch and flip units, I want to layer my white square first, and I want to make sure that marked line is going from the top left corner to the center, just like that, so that when I flip it open, it's turning the right way. And when I'm sewing stitch and flip units like this, I don't want to start at the corner because sometimes your machine can eat that corner. So I always like to turn my piece so I'm starting in the center. It just gives your machine, your needle, a little more to grab onto when you're sewing. I'm going to sew right on that marked line. I don't know if you could hear at the end of that video my machine make that loud noise, but whoops, my machine is having major tension issues. Look at these bad stitches. Now, normally I don't share behind the scenes like this, but I know there's a lot of beginner quilters doing this block of the month with us. So I think it's good to share that tension issues happen. These kind of things happen to sewers of all skill levels. And I wanted to walk you through the steps I took on my machine to fix it. First things first, I cleaned my machine out. So I took out all the parts out. Now, this is all the dust I got out of my machine. It's not tons. I clean my machine fairly often, but I always start there just in case. I also wound a brand new bobbin. So I have a bobbin that's full. Here's what my bobbin was before. So it was getting close to empty. And I know that sometimes my machine can act a little temperamental when it's low on bobbin thread. So I'm going to start with a brand new bobbin here and we'll see if that helps. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is change my needle. So we're gonna just take this one out. I'm gonna share a little trick with you. Here's my needle packs. When I'm switching out my needles, I put my used needles backwards in the case so that I can tell not to use those. And then I grab a new one that's facing forward. And you can just keep them all stored. And then when I'm through with all my needles, I've used them all and they're all turned backwards, I can safely dispose of this in the original pack they came in. So that's a little tip for you. Okay, let's get this brand new needle put in. And then fingers crossed that has solved all of our issues. Okay, let me grab a scrap piece of fabric to test on. I have a scrap piece of fabric here. This is your reminder that if you are testing tension issues, don't start sewing on your project again, because if you are still having issues, you're gonna have to rip out more stitches of your project. So always test on a scrap piece of fabric. Okay, fingers crossed, I hope this works. And it sounded good. The stitches look great. We're good. So they're just basic little steps you can do, but sometimes it's as simple as cleaning your machine, putting in a new bobbin, or changing your needle. So let's get back to sewing. Now that we have those sewed, we're going to trim 1/4 inch seam allowance outside of this line. Now make sure you're not trimming on top because you're gonna cut your piece in half. So outside here. Now I like to trim multiple units at once. And so what I do is I align my sewn line with a line on my cutting mat, and I'll layer multiples together. You can overlap them slightly, just like that. Then I can take my ruler and align my 1/4 inch mark with those sewn lines. Make sure everything is aligned before I cut. Boom! And we've just trimmed everything all at once. Now let's take this over to our ironing board. So we're going to press this triangle open before we sew that other square on, just so we have the space to see our rectangle better. Now that we have this unit pressed, we are going to add a blue square to the other corner of this rectangle. So we're going to line it with the marked line in the top left corner to the center. And again, we're going to start sewing in the center to prevent any machine issues. And just like we did before, you're going to trim 1/4 inch outside of that marked line and then press it toward the blue so you get a unit that looks just like this. It's time to start assembling our block. So we're going to take one of our white squares, one of our half square triangles with the blue facing this direction, and one of our stitch and flip units with the blue touching the blue. We're going to sew these together, and then we're going to sew this to this. Okay, we're going to sew these together, put them right sides together. So with 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to keep sewing. You're going to press toward our square here just to prevent bulk. Now let's go back to our sewing machine, and we're going to sew our stitch and flip unit to the bottom. And we just have a few seams left to go. Now we're sewing these two units together. Make sure your blues are matching. Just sew along that edge with 1/4 inch seam. So it's really important when we're sewing this block together that our 1/4 inch seams are really accurate. And here's why. Because if our 1/4 inch seams were not accurate, our points here with the blue wouldn't align, and they would be off in a little ways. So before you press this unit and sew it into a block, you might just want to open it up and make sure everything is coming to a point together. And if not, rip out that seam line and stitch it again so that they're coming together perfectly. So once you're comfortable with where your unit is sitting, we're going to press toward our stitch and flip unit. Let's lay out our block. So we're going to lay out our units in pairs. We're just going to make sure all of our star points face out, and you get this kind of pinwheel star look. Okay, we're going to sew these two together and these two together, and then sew the pairs together, and our block is complete. Just like we did with the last units, when you open your sewn units together, make sure that these points are aligning right in the middle. If they're off a little bit, you might want to rip your seam and sew again. So we are going to press our seams open because look at all the bulk that's happening. I usually try to avoid pressing open, but today we need to. So we are going to use all of the tools in our arsenal to get the flattest seams we can. So first of all, I'm pressing on a wool pressing mat. Wool pressing mats heat up with the heat from your iron. So it absorbs the heat, and it's almost like you're pressing from the bottom and the top at the same time, and that's going to help you get really flat seams. Okay, once I have pressed, that's be helpful if I turn my iron on, huh? It's still warm. I only turned it off briefly. Okay, once I'm happy with my seam being pressed open, I'm gonna turn it to the front. And I have my little fine mist sprayer that's just filled with some distilled water. I'm just gonna give it a little spritz right along that seam. I don't use steam in my iron because I've had issues with leaky irons in the past. So I keep mine in a spray bottle. And once I have it sprayed, I'm just gonna press along that seam again, just to make sure it's really as flat as I can get it. Okay, last tool in our arsenal is this wooden clapper, and this is weighty. So I'm gonna set this off to the side and just put the clapper on top of that seam, and it's going to press down with weight, hold that seam down on the bulk as it cools down. So we're gonna put that off to the side and do our second unit. Now we're sewing our two halves together and our block is almost complete. Here is our block. You want to make sure that your center is all meeting in the middle nicely. And then we're just going to press open and our block is done. Thank you so much for sewing block 9 with me. You were even along for the ride as I had tension issues. I forgot to turn my iron on at one point. That is just real life in my sewing room sometimes. So we had a relatable start to our September here. I really love this block and I can't wait to see what everyone does with it. There's lots of ways to personalize it with your colors and fabrics. So it'll be very fun to see everyone's versions. So make sure you're tagging me on social media at Happy Hour Stitches. You can email me photos. I can't wait to see pictures. And also make sure you check out the blog. The link is in the video description where you'll find links to other resources for making the block of the month, products I mentioned in this video, and more. So I will see everyone next month for a new block pattern. Thank you so much for joining me today for our little happy hour of sewing time.